What's up guys, Tomas Koeck here, and today we are going to be going over what turned into one of my favorite cameras, the Canon R6. When the Canon R5 and the Canon R6 came out, it basically exploded the market. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was trying to get videos out as fast as possible, but I wanted to wait a little bit until I really knew the ins and outs of this camera, watching other people's reviews, using it on my own, and knowing the ins and outs. So when I give you guys the information, it's actually coming from the heart. It's not just like this regurgitation of information and specs. You know, I don't like those reviews, so that's why I'm waiting so long to actually do this review. Quick preface, I'm at Milford Photo right now. Milford Photo is a photo store located in Milford, Connecticut. They have an online store. They're a local store. They have great staff, great products, and they sell everything at the lowest possible given price as a Canon, Nikon, Olympus, Fujifilm, Sony, Tamron, Sigma official distributor. So definitely check out Milford Photo. They got tons of cool products, and they're actually supplying the Canon R6 for me to use and review. So anyway, let's just dive right into it. So when I saw that these cameras came out, I definitely had my eyes on the Canon R5, and I was like kind of confused on why Canon would come out with something like the Canon R6. You know, it's kind of unusual that they would come out with two mirrorless bodies, one being slightly less expensive, but having much different specs. And as I realized, it has a lot of the same specs that the Canon R5 has, but it also has some specs that are more dedicated toward a different type of photographer and videographer. So one of the main points that you may know is, oh, this camera cannot shoot 8K, but that's not saying this camera doesn't shoot insane video. This camera is capable of shooting C-Log and 1080p and 120 frames per second with autofocus. It can shoot 4K at 60 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 24, etc., etc., etc. And it has all of your basic 1080p. I think they might have even gotten rid of the 720p, which is pretty much a dying breed anyway. But when I first picked up this camera, one thing I noticed is how solid and light it is. This camera's grip is huge, and for a DSLR user, that was really cool because now, you know, one of the things that I always kind of deterred me from mirrorless is that they're kind of small, and I kind of like that nice chunky feeling. Well, I got that feeling with a small camera, which is really cool because of the size of the grip. The ergonomics of this camera are pretty nice. You have your mode dial, which coming from a professional line camera, that's really nice, high quality, nice and smooth. You have your flippy screen, so that's a given nowadays for most Canon cameras. They have a different setup than the Canon R5. The Canon R5, you do have that top LCD screen. You don't have that with the R6. You have two SD card slots, which is awesome when you don't want to actually, it's awesome for a couple reasons. One, you can shoot for longer because you can go on these long trips and not having to worry about having to switch out SD cards, which can distract you if you're in the middle of the shoot. Two, you don't have the risk of losing information and like having an SD card fail on you and losing all your shots if you set it so that the camera takes video and photo on both SD cards. So when you take a photo, it'll copy it from one SD card to the other, so you have two copies of it, which is really, really cool. So as far as battery goes, this camera takes the LPE6 batteries, but also takes the newer version that's coming out with the Canon R5 and the Canon R6, and that lasts a lot longer. I was actually really surprised in how long this camera lasted in the field without having to change the battery. That's one thing that's always deterred me from getting mirrorless, is purely because the battery life on mirrorless has always kind of sucked, but now it's getting a lot better and it's actually really good. It's like it's pretty much as good as DSLRs were, you know, a couple years ago. So they're catching up, they're getting better. The last thing I wanted to say here with the ergonomics is on the side you have all of your basic inputs here. You have your mic, you have your headphone jack, you have your remote input. Yeah, you have an HDMI out and you have the new USB 3. Not to regurgitate information, but we're going to go a little bit into the specs of this camera and then I'll tell you how it helped me in the field. So this camera is an insane photographer's camera. It shoots with a 20 megapixel sensor. It may sound like it's not a lot in this day and age, but because you're shooting with a full frame camera, you're going to be having a very large pixel area, which means more detail. Like I said before, this is basically a Canon 1DX Mark III in a mirrorless body. So it's kind of cool how they came out with that only 6 months after the Canon 1DX Mark III came out, so people can now figure out if they want to go mirrorless or if they want to stick with the old DSLR king. It shoots 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, and it shoots 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter, which I was talking about with my buddy Matt here. He's filming right now. You're basically shooting video with a camera, like taking photos. It's kind of crazy. And I found that when I was taking wildlife shots, the autofocus was insane. They have their latest autofocus technology in there. You know, again, it's the same technology as the Canon 1DX Mark III. And I was having a great time shooting a lot of the bird life during my downtime with filming this film, Reef Jumper, which you'll see coming out in a couple of weeks. Anyway, with the video, this camera can shoot C-Log, which is Canon's version of the RAW format with video, which means the colors are going to be brighter, they're going to be more saturated, and they're going to be much more realistic to what you're shooting out in the field. And you can mess with the tone curve a lot more and get tons more detail out of it, which is awesome. Like all the other Canon cameras that have been coming out nowadays, this has the dual pixel autofocus, which you can look at any other person's video. The dual pixel autofocus is pretty much still the undisputed king of autofocus. Sony's getting a little bit closer, Nikon's getting a little bit closer, but Canon's still on top in terms of having that nice cinematic, smooth autofocus. And that it shoots with dual pixel autofocus with any of its video settings, if I remember correctly, which means that the 1080p at 120 frames per second worked like a charm. It was an absolute dream to use. The last thing I want to talk about when shooting with video and with photo is the image stabilization in this camera is really, really nice. I'm not going to shake this camera violently, but if you tip this camera back and forth, you can feel the vibrations of the mechanics kind of moving around. That's the 8 stops of image stabilization. So when I was shooting with video and photo, it was like a dream. Like I could be shaking this camera around and still be getting clear shots because the image stabilization is so good. And when you pair that with a lens that also has good image stabilization, optical stabilization, whatever the heck you call it, you're going to be having a great time even in the worst conditions. And that makes it really good, especially with wildlife photography, because wildlife photographers, you know as much as I do that the wildlife is most active early in the morning and late in the evening when the lighting is not as good. So because the image stabilization is so good, that means you can be shooting at lower shutter speeds, capturing that wildlife in the field in dark situations, but not having that blur effect, because finally we have a camera that can keep up with the shakiness of our hand. The final important thing I want to talk about is the usability of this camera. I had a great time with it. I had no problems with it. Canon has finally made it so that the software on this camera is finally keeping up to what we want. I don't know what they were planning with that whole Canon R thing with like the touchpad and stuff, but they got rid of that, and it's really easy and fun to use. Because this camera is so small, it took up no space in my camera bag. I could fit all my big DSLRs in the camera bag as well, and all my big telephoto lenses. And because it's so powerful, it became one of the main cameras to use on my trip, where I found that I was hardly using any other camera because this camera basically fit all the needs that I needed to use it with. The only instance where I found that I needed to swap out cameras was with some wildlife situations where I needed a crop sensor camera to kind of get that extra, tight shot so that, it's as close to the animal as possible. And that's where having higher megapixels would have been a great thing. Still, this camera seemed to handle itself really, really well given any situation, any video, photo task that I needed it to fulfill. I never needed to use this specifically, but Canon's been doing a really good job with having all of its cameras come out with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi capability, where I was able to link this with my phone and take pictures just with my phone with the camera on a tripod like 15 feet away from me. That was really good and really useful, because if you're on your own doing a lot of these projects, all of a sudden you basically have given yourself another photographer having that Bluetooth in the camera and having it being able to set your camera up, being far away from the camera, and still being able to take the pictures all from the palm of your hand. And because this camera is weather sealed, I was able to take this camera really close to the freaking ocean and not having to worry about any like spray or ocean spray going on the camera and ruining everything. Because we hate sand, we hate salt when it comes to cameras. So going out there with the peace of mind that as long as I didn't bury this thing in the sand, that anything was gonna happen to it was really, really pleasing for me, especially as a wildlife and outdoor photographer. I just wanted to note this too, when you take the cover off of the camera, they had this with the R and RP as well, but you'll see that now all of the sensors for the Canon mirrorless cameras are being covered. So I don't know, I thought that was really cool, because that's something I always worry about in the field when I'm taking lenses off and stuff, is I don't want sensors to get any sand, dust, or dirt on them, because I'm in the outdoors. I'm not in this controlled studio and controlled environment where I'm not worried about any dust and stuff getting on my camera. So that was really cool too. So because of the combination of the weatherproof sealing and the cover to the sensor, this is basically a really good setup for any outdoor photographer. You may be wondering, who's this camera for? Well, quite frankly, it's for everybody. It's a great photographer's camera and it's a great videographer's camera. It shoots great video, it shoots great raw video, it has wicked fast biff, and quite frankly was just a joy and a dream to use. Anyway, that's the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope I convinced you to buy this camera, because this is something that I'm definitely adding to my camera bag whenever I can. If you haven't already, check out Milford Photo's website at www.milfordphoto.com, where they have cameras like this and tons of other lenses and equipment, Tamron, Sigma, Sony, Olympus, Fujifilm, Canon, you name it, and tons of other gear as well. So anyway, thanks guys, peace out, and I'll catch you later.